Okay, good afternoon everyone, and thanks a lot for coming. We appreciate your visit to the fountain today. What we're going to show you here are a couple of weapons that Pedro Menendez Diavalos brought to the New World in September of 1565. I'm sure you recognize this as a crossbow. Back here we have the cannon we're going to fire for you. Both of these weapons have something in common. They were obsolete when they got here. And the reason that they're here is because they were cheap to buy. When you were the Adelantado, the man who was first, the leader of the expedition to the New World, during the Age of Discovery, this is the way Spain worked it. You, as the leader, were responsible for financing the entire voyage. You had to get the ships, get the men, and equip them. Now, this is quite an outlay of money. Most of the guys, even rich ones, did not have that kind of money. So they had investors, people they had to pay back if they were successful. Menendez had 14 of them for the Enterprise of Florida. Now the point I'm trying to make is he only had this amount of money, so he's trying to make it go as far as possible. He's looking for things that are going to be useful but not exactly expensive to buy, and help him in the settling of St. Augustine. Now we know there are 30 crossbows aboard the ships when they landed here, and this is fairly typical of the kind of crossbow you would have seen the Spanish soldier carry. I like to call it a munitions grade crossbow. What I'm talking about is there's no decoration on it. It's a very plain, simple, functional crossbow. This would have been the kind of crossbow that the soldier would have carried. The stock was always hardwood. In this case it's oak, but most of the time it was walnut. That was a little lighter wood. Up here we have what's called the stirrup. You'll see why in a minute. This is the prod or the limb of the crossbow. Both of these items are held onto the wooden stock by the use of what are called bow irons. You've got two clamps on either side, then you've got a pair of anvils, one here against the wood and the bottom one that's floating, and a pair of wedges. So if this got loose for any reason, all you had to do is take a hammer or something hard, hit the wedges, and it would tighten it right back up. The bowstring was generally made out of linen thread. The reason for that was that the linen did not stretch when it got wet. Back here we have what's called the roller nut. This is the most common trigger mechanism. The bowstring sits in these two hooks. It's held in place by this long S-shaped trigger called a tickler. Pull up on it, it rolls forward. The clip here is to keep the ammunition in the notches on top of the table of the crossbow. To cock the crossbow, generally you put it on the ground, put your foot in the stirrup, lean over, and pull it up. Here we go. It's ready to go. Now, the kind of ammunition they used looked very much like this. The iron point is, steel point rather, is called a bodkin point, and it was good for penetrating leather armor and chainmail. Now, the interesting thing about the tips on crossbow bolts is they weren't glued on, and there was a reason for that. If it's stuck in you and you try to pull it out, the tip's still there, and you need to get that out. So you got to find somebody with some forceps, go around there, dig around, find that thing, and pull it out. Not very nice. The other thing was to push it through. But in any case, you know, they were nasty people. What can I say? All right, now to fire, you'll notice there are only two flights. The reason for that was it needs to lay flat on top of the table of the crossbow in order to be accurate. The only sight that you have for a crossbow is the tip. There's no rear sight usually. You just know how your crossbow works and what it's likely to do when you pull the trigger.
Oh, bullseye.
Okay, that's the last one I'll give today. Most of them will end up in the creek. In any case, the other thing they were used for was for hunting. The nice thing about a crossbow is it doesn't make a lot of noise. So if you miss the rabbit the first time, maybe you got a second chance and have some meat for the pot that night. Okay, well that's it for the crossbow. Let's move on to the cannon. Thank you.
Here goes the cannon.
So our cannon is a replica. It's not an original, but it's a very good copy of the kind of cannons that Pedro Menendez and his men brought here in 1565. In fact, he brought 20 cannons that look a lot like ours, and he fortified this area right through here with those. So not only is the field of Manu the site of the first settlement here in St. Augustine, this is also the site of the first fort that was built here. Now those types of cannons were considered to be obsolete by the 1500s. They're products and technology from the 13 and 1400s. So it was an old, obsolete type cannon that nobody in Europe really wanted to use anymore. So they were cheap to get. Quite a few of the early conquistadors and explorers that came to the New World brought that type of cannon with them at first because they're easy to handle and they were cheap, like I said, sometimes free. Now, 1500s, they were able to produce big cast iron cannons like this. They had the technology to do that. These are much more powerful than that type of cannon. A little slow to load. They're muzzle loaders, which means everything has to be loaded down the barrel from the front. So gunpowder, then wadding, and the cannonball, all pushed down the barrel with a ramrod. And after you fire that cannon, you have to swab it out before you reload it, which means you dunk something like this in a bucket of water, and then you run that down the barrel of the cannon to put out any embers from your last cannon shot. So that made them a little slow to load. It took a minute to a minute and a half to load this cannon, but very, very powerful. The two we have on the pedestals here are called Spanish long nines. They were around by Menendez's time here. They fired 9-pound cannonballs almost 2 miles.
Dang.
It's pretty powerful. Our cannon, on the other hand, not so much. But when our cannon was made back in those early 13, 1400s, they didn't have the same technology. And when they made the cannon barrel, they made it as a tube that was open at both ends.
Oh no.
So you got the gunpowder and the wadding in a whole separate piece called the powder mug or the servidor, and that's the cylinder that's sitting beside the cannon at the tail of it. We have one loaded with gunpowder and wadding already in the cannon right now. Gunpowder and wadding in the servidor will slide up into the open breech end of the cannon, and then a big block of wood sits in behind that. That's called the breech block. That holds the servidor in place. While that's being done, somebody else is loading the cannonball, but from the muzzle end. So it's a breech charge muzzle loaded cannon. They called them bombardettas. Now, the difference about that one is once you fire that cannon, you pull the block of wood out, then you pull the servidor out. Now you got another one. It's already loaded with gunpowder and wadding. You can quickly reload the gun. You're going to get your second shot off in about 25 seconds, more or less. And if you have 3 or more servidors per cannon, which was quite common, you got a 5-man crew switching these things out. A couple of the guys are reloading them with gunpowder and wadding. And you keep up this fast rate of fire, somewhere between 2 and 3 shots a minute was the norm.
He's gonna hit a
Now that's 3 times as fast as these
No,
types
just
of
gunpowder.
cannons,
They don't
but
shoot
they were
anything out.
nowhere near as powerful. They
Yeah,
were
dude.
very,
They just shoot
very
gunpowder.
weak
They don't put
in
they don't put anything in
They
it.
could only fire small cannonballs. Now ours would fire a 6-pound iron shot. These are solid iron. They don't explode. In fact, they didn't even have exploding cannonballs till the 1700s. If you put a full load of gunpowder in the servidor, our cannon could send that ball almost a mile. So I use the Bridge of Lions down there as a reference. That's about 9/10 of a mile from here. That gives you a pretty good idea of their maximum range. Now these things were not accurate at that kind of distance, but the gunners did train to hit targets at about a half a mile, a little bit beyond that. They were supposed to practice once a week, King's orders. I suppose they did, but we know that they were pretty good at hitting targets at a half a mile with these old guns. So what happens if the enemy ever showed up around here and they got big ships, and on their ships they got lots of cannons that fire 2 miles? Now what do we do? How do we defend ourselves here? Well, that's why Menendez chose to fortify this piece of ground we're on. Now he knew that the inlet that existed back in those days, the original inlet, which is over by the lighthouse today, it's not the same inlet we have today. The original inlet was very
Lighthouse is over
narrow, and it was only 9.5 feet deep, and that was at high tide, and that was too shallow for large ships to come through. They had to remain offshore. That was more than 2 miles from here. 2-mile cannons could never reach us. And Menendez knew if anybody were going to attack us here, they'd be coming across that bay, some sort of smaller boat, something perhaps as large as our chalupa replica that's at the boathouse over there. Now, the bay was very different than we see it today. All the vegetation and mangroves that we have today did not exist back then. This was a wide open bay, and you could see to the other side clearly. Once the enemy got halfway across that bay, heading this way, they were now within range of our cannons. Now remember, we have 20 cannons here, and each one of them firing 2 and sometimes 3 shots a minute. Now that's a lot of cannonballs flying out of here. And even though these don't look like much, they're kind of small cannonballs. These are flying through the air at over 400 miles an hour. It smashed through boats like that chalupa over there, like it was made out of cardboard. You can only imagine what would happen to the soldiers in the boat. If you didn't get hit directly by the cannonball, you'd most likely be injured or wounded by some giant splinter of wood as the boat flies apart when it gets hit. And if the boat begins to sink, the fact that most Europeans couldn't even swim in the 1600s, 1700s, 1500s, that just was not normal. It just didn't swim. So 9.5 feet of water is starting to sound pretty deep now. I think you get the point. These cannons were old, they were obsolete, nobody in Europe even wanted them anymore. They were adequate to defend our spot here. Now the amount of gunpowder that you use in these cannons varies from cannon type to cannon type and the weight of the cannonball. On our cannon, they would have been using about 1.5 pounds of black powder. Well, guess what we're not going to do today? Even though that'd be pretty spectacular, something you wouldn't forget for a while, you also wouldn't be able to hear anything for a couple of days. So we're not going to do that to you. We're going to use a smaller load. After we fire the cannon, I'll tell you how much gunpowder it is we actually use. I think you'll be surprised. The disappointing news is that we are not actually firing a cannonball out of our cannon.
I already knew that.
I know. It sounds like it'd be a lot of fun, doesn't it? But Coast Guard and the Marine Patrol are usually out there, and those guys have no sense of humor. Hey, my buddy and I, we don't want to go to prison dressed like this. It's going to be a blank shot only. It's not so loud it's going to damage your hearing. However, heed the signs. Children and anybody with sensitive hearing, you should cover your ears. So if everybody's ready, we are going to fire away.
Close your ears, sir. It's really loud. No, this is really.
Cover your ears. Buenas España! Huevo!
Got a baby time. Got a baby time. Good job.
If you like the smell of that stuff, you got job applications. So, instead of 1.5 pounds of black powder, what you heard was only 2 ounces. Just use a small bottle of black powder like that. Put it in the servidor. We put Spanish moss in there for wadding. It works really good. We pack it tight.
Did you hear it?
Packing it tight, it makes for a pretty loud bang. The truth is, if we had put a cannonball down the barrel, 2 ounces of gunpowder never would have come out of the tube anyway. There's a lot of noise, not enough power though. Hope you enjoyed that.
Thank
if you
you.
have any questions, feel free to hang around. Be glad to answer them. If not, the tower is open, and have a great day, guys.
Tower's open.
What?
Line it up. Hey, they want to walk up.